There are growing questions over whether Cuba's mass anti-government protests can survive a crackdown by the country's communist regime. The Economist explains, quote, the coming weeks will show whether the regime's stock response of swatting down any signs of dissent will work again. The island nation has been rocked by some of the biggest demonstrations in 6 decades, with many protesters demanding an end to the 62-year dictatorship. Cuba is also grappling with rising COVID cases and economic instability made worse by a lack of tourism during the pandemic. Roseann Lake joins me now from New York. She is the Cuba correspondent for The Economist. Roseann, welcome. Great to have you with us. So Cuban protesters have a long list of grievances, from government repression to shortages of everything from food to electricity. But these are not new grievances. What is different about this moment that has seemingly brought everything to a head?
What's different about this moment is that in addition to those grievances, which are certainly very meaningful grievances, right, to have electricity shortages, to have your internet cut, to have there be no food on the shelves, these are things that Cubans are more or less more or less used to. But the important one that's been added is libertad, freedom. The thing they're most reclaiming from their government and to the world really is that they be finally given freedom.
And of course, the internet and social media came relatively late to the island, but it's been a game changer here. And we've seen the power it can have to galvanize other political movements like the Arab Spring, for instance. Was the Cuban government unprepared for this element? And could the internet ensure that this protest movement has staying power?
Well, it has already. I mean, the internet has been, largely responsible for allowing Cubans just to sort of mobilize, right, to talk to one another, to know where things are happening, and also to see what's going on out in the outside world, right? Many of them have relatives abroad, and they see that their lives are different from what they are, elsewhere, and they certainly have relied on the internet to do that. Now, what we're seeing in terms of footage coming out, you always have to be careful when you're seeing videos. That the peak of the protests took place on the 11th, and obviously there were lots of Cubans on the street recording these things. Many of them weren't able to upload them immediately because internet access was cut, but it certainly has done a great job of just showing people what was happening, the way the government responded with repression, the way that there were plainclothes officers on the streets with bats, that they were being brought in cars and on motorcycles when there's no petrol or no gasoline for ambulances. This all became very apparent, and the videos are circulating, and it's bringing, I would say, international awareness to what's happening in Cuba right now, and it should.
Right, and I'm glad you bring up the videos because, of course, I've been paying very close attention to these, largely bootleg videos coming off the island. And like you said, they're coming at different times, and there's not often a lot of context to what you see. So it's hard to tell when they were shot, where they were shot exactly, and who is involved. And so it's hard to sort of get real-time information. What is the latest you're hearing about the status of actual protests in the streets and the status of the police crackdown?
Right. Well, that's a difficult question to answer because it's different all over the island. There's a map that tells you on a daily basis which cities are having protests, and of course they vary in size. But that's sort of been the most reliable way of tracking. I think another useful barometer is a Google Doc that's going around of people who have gone missing. So last I checked, it was over 200 people who just couldn't be accounted for. And usually these are people who are associated with being sort of at the head of different movements or gatherings of protesters, and they've gone missing. Some of them have been violently taken from their houses. But again, I've also seen reports of people who are walking down the street, and maybe for walking on the wrong side of the street because it's forbidden to walk on a certain side of the street for security reasons, were detained. Sometimes they're detained for 20 minutes. Sometimes it's several hours. Sometimes, their families can't find them. But this certainly is continuing. And I actually just spoke with a very close, trusted source of mine who's very close to, how the U.S. is going to respond. And he said he really thinks that this will probably be over in a matter of days, that this is the end of the dictatorship. Now, that's a very, very, very bold statement, and I'm not privy to what he's basing it on, but this is something that he has indeed said, which would be tremendous.
But see, the only way that I can imagine that could ever take place without U.S. intervention, which I know is a non-starter, would be if the military itself turned against, the leaders. And that is something that I know a lot of Cubans are holding out hope for, because obviously the members of the police force and the military live in Cuba. They are, they're subject to the same elements of Cuban life that everyone else is subjected to. So it's not, outside of the pale to imagine that they might actually side with the protesters. But that's the only way I could imagine this ending peacefully.
Oh, yes. Peacefully, I don't think it will end anytime soon. This is going to be, it will be a very hard slog, and it's going to be difficult, and it's certainly painful to watch. But as you said, these are people who live in Cuba. They understand what their families go through. They understand what it's like to get food and just basic things. And they understand that, a lot of the times that the hardships that Cubans endure are not purely the result of a U.S. economic embargo. They understand that there's an internal embargo that their government imposes on them because, as one economist that I like to chat with says, Cuba is the only country in the world that fights wealth instead of poverty. The accumulation of wealth is just something that is not allowed. And, Cubans are tired of doing that. And as you know well, because you're Cuban yourself, Cubans are incredibly resourceful and entrepreneurial people. And it's remarkable and always thrilling to see what they're able to accomplish within the very strict realm of what they're allowed to do legally in the private sector especially. And so I think they've really just come to a point where they've had enough, right? Se acabó, as that famous Padre Vida song was saying, right? Se acabó. And another important element of context here, I think, is also the Movimiento San Isidro. So back in November, we saw how a group of artists got together, and they also gained, worldwide attention. Padre Vida is a song that came from their movement when they stood up to the government, right? You had 300 people, not all of them associated with this movement, but they stood outside the Ministry of Culture. And they asked to speak with the Minister of Culture. He never showed up. The Vice Minister of Culture showed up several hours later, but there were 300 people at that gathering. And I spoke to people in that movement who are obviously very involved in the protest now, and they said at the time that seemed unprecedented. To see 300 Cubans together in one space, peacefully, requesting that they be heard by their leaders was just, it was chilling to all of them because it just didn't happen. And speaking to these same people over the weekend who, went from to various places, not various cities, but various places around Havana and around the island, seeing just how many more people had joined their cause to them was just, it was exhilarating because they didn't imagine that it was something that would come so quickly. But a lot of people seem to agree that this group in many ways sort of helped spark an awakening and this realization that they too could ask for these things, right? There are plenty of grievances, as we said, and we can add vaccines and everything else to it, but they're not asking for those things. They're also not even asking for the U.S. to lift the embargo. They're asking for freedom. And of course, the support of the U.S. in that. But freedom is the bottom line.
Well, let's take a step back and talk about the U.S. embargo for a second, because, a lot of our viewers, may not be as familiar with some of the details. So recently, as you know, the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation faced backlash earlier this week after posting a statement sort of blaming U.S. policy, specifically the embargo, for Cuba's suffering. This, of course, parrots the Cuban government's views, as we heard recently from Cuba's current president, Miguel Diaz-Canel. Of course, the embargo, no one can deny, has a role in Cuba's economy and not a positive role, but it's a lot more complicated than that. So if you could break down for us, what role does the U.S. government play in all of this, and what role does that so-called internal embargo that you mentioned play?
Yes, it's a very good question, and it tends to get very confusing because when we hear the word embargo, we think a blanket embargo, right? Nothing can be done. But as we all know, embargoes are probably effective at 2 points in time. One, as a threat before they're enacted, and two, when they're lifted, right? They're of very little use. And for very complicated reasons, this one has existed for a long time. And it does make life difficult for Cubans. Of course it does. I mean, it means that, Cuba sort of becomes an anathema for a lot of international businesses, because heaven forbid, you be doing business with the U.S. and with somebody else, but something you be associated with Cuba, you could be hit with very heavy, fines by OFAC. It does make things problematic. But one thing that is very important and worth clarifying is that it does exclude the export of, ever since I believe it was 2001, U.S. sanctions against Cuba have exempted food and medicine, and the U.S. actually exports a lot of food to Cuba, which doesn't really justify why there still is none on the shelves. That's because Cuba has no foreign exchange with which to buy it. And that's we can get to their internal embargo later. But also, in the sanctions, and of course the sanctions, the heavier sanctions that are imposed by the Trump administration on the military, just yesterday, President Biden noted that he would be keeping those in place. And of course, that's a very difficult decision, right? Because ultimately, they were sanctions on remittances that pass through banks affiliated with the Cuban armed forces. Not sanctions on remittances in general, but sanctions that pass through accounts affiliated with the Cuban armed forces. Now, this, of course, is a very difficult call, and Cubans in Miami and all over the world who send money to their family members know it. They know that every time they send $1 or €1 to Cuba, this is money that ultimately is going to end up in the hands of the government, because where is it going to be spent? It's going to be spent in the MLC stores, the convertible currency stores that accept dollars, right? And so, you know, there is the Cuban armed forces do make money off of remittances that are being sent to Cuba, and I think the idea was to cut that off, right? Especially at a time now when you know, giving them more money would probably not be good for the Cuban people, because it could mean more oppression. And then there's the internal embargo. And that one is, oh my goodness, you could write a very colorful book about the internal embargo. It essentially boils down to micromanaging the economy. So as you probably know, the dual currency system that took place in Cuba for a very long time was eliminated in January. And after it, you know, the Cuban government was trying to figure out how to price things in pesos now that the CBSN no longer existed. And they quibbled over things like the price of a scoop of ice cream. You cannot have, you know, an effective, productive economy when you do things like that. You can't have, you know, you can't expect to have food on your shelves when you import 70% of it, but you export nothing, and you have no foreign exchange except for, you know, what you maybe get from tourism and some of the medicines and the doctors that you have in other countries. If you don't have that foreign currency, you also can't live off the charity of relatives of Cubans that are abroad that, of course, don't want to see their families starving, so they send them money, but at the same time do it with a heavy heart, because they don't want to send more money to a government that they know is fleecing their own people. And so you have these two very complicated embargoes, both of them equally pernicious, and both of them that should be eliminated. And, you know, I think the Cuban people are responding to that.
Well, Roseann Lake, could talk to you about this all day, but thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.